The Orioles split their doubleheader with the Toronto Blue Jays on Monday. We'll talk about the good, Zach Eflin's debut in an Oriole uniform, and James McCann somehow playing 9 innings of baseball. And we'll talk about the bad, Cade Povich struggling, and the Orioles' defensive woes. It's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, July 30th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap both games in the doubleheader between the Orioles and the Blue Jays on Monday, with the O's winning the first game in the double dip 11-5 and then falling 8-4 in game two. I'll get you what went right, what went wrong, and a shout out in both of those games between Baltimore and Toronto. We will talk about Zach Eflin's Orioles debut. We will talk about Cade Povich's struggles. We'll talk about the offense waking up and James McCann getting hit in the nose. And then at the end of the show, we'll talk a little trade deadline, because today is the day, 6 p.m. Eastern time today. On Tuesday is the MLB trade deadline. What can the Orioles still do between now and then? We'll discuss that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use code all lowercase Locked On MLB for a first deposit match up to $100. So we're going to begin today with game one of the doubleheader between the O's and Blue Jays, also game one of a 4-game series. It'll be played this week, Monday through Wednesday at Oriole Park. Again, I do apologize. The voice coming back a little more, still bothering me a bit. So just going to get through this podcast the best I can. But we start with game one of the doubleheader on Monday afternoon. Final score, Orioles 11 and the Blue Jays 5, as the O's took game number one. And we'll start with what went right from that one. And what went right? Well, it was the Orioles offense. For the second straight day, the offense really did it all. And honestly, it was better on Monday than it was in the win Sunday over the Padres. This is one of the Orioles' most complete offensive performances of the year. And it comes at a great time when the O's offense has kind of been scuffling here in the month of July. So to see this right at the end is really, really encouraging. 11 runs for the O's on 13 hits. They drew 8 walks for the second consecutive game, also walked 8 times on Sunday. The O's walked only once, or I should say the O's walked 8 times only once in the first, what is this math, 105 games of the year, 104 games of the year. And then in their next 2, they walked back-to-back 8 times. They struck out only 4 times. They hit 2 home runs, which, is Orioles baseball, but that's not 13 runs. Only 3 of the 11 runs came in via the long ball. They brought runners home from third with less than 2 outs. They had 14 hard hit balls. They really looked up and down, really effective, really dominant. And it was that new lineup for the second straight day, with Colton Cowser hitting leadoff, Gunnar Henderson in the 3-hole. It was Adley Rutschman who didn't catch game one, because in a doubleheader, you're only going to catch once. So Anthony Santander was in the 2-hole again for the Orioles, and it just kind of worked. The buttons that Brandon Hyde pushed worked again in this one. I mean, it started in the first inning. They get 4 runs off of Yariel Rodriguez with only getting 1 hit. Now, he was wild on one hand, but on the other hand, the Orioles did not chase out of the strike zone. And Rodriguez didn't even finish the first inning, walked 4 batters, recorded only 2 outs, and left the game. And although Rodriguez's season overall has been a bit disappointing for the Blue Jays, he's coming off it. It's like 4 starts in a row where he has been really, really good. And this was surprising after he's been good over the last 3 weeks or so to come out like this. And the Orioles just knock him out of the game in the first inning. That was very impressive plate discipline by the O's. And here was another thing, right? Like, they made every pitcher work in this game. It wasn't just Rodriguez, but it was Brandon Eisert who came out of the pen and gave up 3 runs. And it was Yeri Rodriguez who gave up 3 runs. And it was Richards and Swanson who finished off the game for the Blue Jays. The Orioles made these guys throw, like, getting towards 200 pitches in this game. And the O's had 44 foul balls as a team in 8 innings of baseball. You're looking at 44 foul balls in 8 innings is kind of absurd. I mean, it's 5.5 foul balls per inning. You're just fouling stuff off all day, getting deeper into counts, working pitchers, and then coming up with big hits. Ryan Mountcastle, 3 hits and a home run. He's got his 4th multi-hit game in his last 6 after game 1. Jordan Westberg had 3 doubles. It was the first multi-double game of his career, and he had 3 of them. Anthony Santander kind of put the icing on the cake with a 2-run shot, his 30th home run of the year. He's 4th in baseball. All 9 starters reached base for the Orioles. And even Christian Pache, who came in for defense but got himself an at-bat in the 8th, he singled in his first Orioles at-bat, 102.5 off the bat, a line drive to shortstop for a single in the 8th inning. So, I mean, everything worked for the Orioles offensively in this win. Now, what went wrong in game 1 of the doubleheader? Well, that was the state of James McCann's nose. Quite a scene. He comes up, bases loaded, 2 outs. The Orioles already leading 3-0 in the first inning against Yariel Rodriguez. They've run up his pitch count. They're working counts. And Rodriguez, I think it was a 2-1 fastball at 95 miles an hour, runs up and in and strikes James McCann in the face. It's an RBI hit by pitch. It makes it a 4-0 Orioles lead, but that was not what the O's were concerned about. They were concerned about McCann, who immediately went down. I mean, it was a scary scene to see it. He was down for a while. I mean, blood was kind of gushing out of his nose really for a long time. It was surprising just how long he continued to bleed. And the Orioles training staff did the best job they could to stop the bleeding. And you see this whole scene. They're out there 5-10 minutes working with McCann, trying to get him cleaned up, trying to get him back together. And it did help that in that time, John Schneider, the Blue Jays manager, came out and made a pitching change, took his starter out with 2 outs in the first inning. And McCann goes back in the dugout to get cleaned up. His jersey's all bloody. They bring him out of New Jersey. And then he just walks back out and stands on first base and stays in the game. They had the 2 nose plugs up in there to stop the bleeding. It was still bleeding throughout the game at times. It was bleeding a bit during his post-game interviews. I couldn't believe he stayed in this ball game. But you look at the situation, it's a doubleheader. It's hot. You really don't want Adley Rutschman to have to catch 17 innings of a doubleheader, or at the worst, have to bring him in and then, make a roster move before game 2 and activate most likely David Banuelos, who's the taxi squad catcher with the team. And you're not sure you want to put McCann on the IL, so you'd have to send somebody down who maybe doesn't deserve it just to get Banuelos so he could catch game 2 of the doubleheader. Like, I'm sure McCann was thinking of that. Like, that would have put the O's in a really, really tough position if he had to leave that game in game 1 of the doubleheader in the first inning, and he just stayed in there. I mean, he had a nasty black eye by the end of the game. It was getting worse when they were showing him in the dugout during game 2. Quite a shiner. It did not look good. But you know what? And probably, I mean, again, not a doctor, probably not the smartest move to stay in that ball game, but he passed the concussion test to stay on the field. Brandon Hyde said after the game, they're lucky he kind of didn't have any structural damage. He'll go for a CT scan just to make sure everything's good, but he seems to be okay. And he goes out there, he catches a great game. He gets a hit, he gets an RBI, and the Orioles win. Like, I mean, that's going to earn you a lot of respect in the clubhouse. McCann already had a ton of it, but I cannot believe he played that baseball game like that. I mean, it looked like by the end of the game when he took his helmet off to celebrate the win, his left eye was almost closed shut. I'm like, how do you catch back there like that? And somehow he did it. And the shout out to in game 1 goes to Zach Eflin in his Orioles debut. Eflin, the starting pitcher who the Orioles acquired in a trade with the Tampa Bay Rays on Friday for 3 prospects. He kind of will now slot in for now as the Orioles' number 3 starter to bolster this rotation. And he looked solid in his first start. That is what he does. 6 innings of 3-run ball, a quality start. Now, he did give up 10 hits, which is the second most he's given up this year, but his 7 strikeouts tied a season high. And in typical Zach Eflin fashion, he did not walk any Blue Jays batter in 6 innings. The one big blow was a 3-run homer he allowed to Addison Barger in the 5th inning. It was a first career home run for Barger, who's a fairly highly rated hitting prospect for the Blue Jays, who has been called up in the last few weeks. And Barger was only in the game because Justin Turner started this game at first base, had 1 at-bat, had a single, and then came out of the game because the Blue Jays during the game traded Justin Turner to the Mariners. So Barger replaced him in the lineup. And Barger, I mean, Eflin just hung a curveball to him on the first pitch, and Barger hit a 3-run homer. And Eflin did a nice job. He had that rough 5th, but he came back out there and got a 1-2-3-6 to finish off the quality start. And yeah, 10 strikeouts or 10 hits isn't what you want, but 9 of the 10 hits were singles. It was the one home run and 9 singles, and not a lot of them were hit super hard. And that's what's going to happen to Eflin because he mixes his pitches so well and he keeps guys off balance, and that's what he did once again. I thought the cutter was really good. That was his main pitch. 38 of his 98 offerings were on the cutter. He got 8 whiffs on that thing. He had a career high 5 of his 7 strikeouts with that cut fastball against righties and lefties. Again, 10 hits you don't love, but 7 Ks, no walks, 3 runs, 6 innings. Like, I really liked what I saw in Zach Eflin's Orioles debut, and it's just so refreshing to see somebody go out there and just hate walking guys and just not walk guys, especially after what we're going to talk about from the O starter in game 2. Very refreshing to watch, and he helps the O's to an 11-5 victory in game 1 of the doubleheader. But the Orioles had a chance to then sweep that doubleheader and extend their lead in the AL East. Unfortunately, they weren't able to do it as they dropped game 2, and I will recap that one coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Supply House. You can order supplies from the website that's made for the skilled trades. Find thousands of parts from hundreds of brands in just a couple clicks at supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com gives you 24/7 access to a huge selection of plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with fast delivery anywhere in the U.S. Need help with an order? You can get industry-leading after-sales service from their friendly and knowledgeable customer support team and talk to a real person every time. And there's great news for plumbers, technicians, and contractors. Being a pro has its perks. Trade industry professionals can join their free TradeMaster program for free shipping and serious discounts on every order. Over 100,000 pros already trust the TradeMaster program to deliver results. Apply for your membership today and get a competitive edge on every order at supplyhouse.com/TM. Save money and time when you order online. Order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from supplyhouse.com. Real people, real service. So the bats exploded and Eflin looked good as the Orioles took game 1 over the Blue Jays, but they could not complete the doubleheader sweep as they fell to Toronto 8-4 in game number 2 of Monday's doubleheader to even up the 4-game set at 1 apiece and even up the season series to 4 games apiece between these two teams. With the 1-1 doubleheader, the Orioles go to 63-44 on the season. The Yankees just erupted in Philadelphia. They treated Zach Wheeler like the Orioles treated him earlier this year, beat the Phillies 14-4. So because of that, the O's go into Tuesday with just a half-game lead over the Yankees as they still sit atop the AL East. But what went right in that loss in game 2 was, well, I think the offense kept up the good at-bats. Now, they still only scored 4 runs. That's not 11 runs, but they had 9 hits. They drew a couple of walks. They didn't strike out too much. They had 14 hard-hit balls once again. Overall, you're looking at a pretty solid day from the offense despite 4 runs. 7 of the 9 starters had a hit in this game, which was good to see for the Orioles. Heston Kjerstad had a rough day, 0 for 4 with 2 strikeouts. But the other guy who went 0 for was Adley Rutschman, who's been mired in a pretty devastating slump lately. And he did go 0 for 4 with a strikeout. But after he looked lost at the plate in the first inning and struck out, he put together 3 really good at-bats in his next 3 plate appearances, hit the ball hard every time, and just was not rewarded in those next 3 at-bats. It was a bad luck 0 for 4 for Adley. I think the breakout of the slump is coming here on Tuesday or Wednesday, so keep your eye out for that. But overall, I think they look good. Like Bowden Francis, they jumped on him. Colton Cowser, leadoff home run, getting himself put right back in the leadoff spot. He's now 14 for 40. That's a 350 batting average during this 11-game hitting streak that he is on, starting to swing the bat much, much better, having a really good July that he's putting together after he struggled in May and June. They got a 2-run homer from Jordan Westburg in the second that tied the game at 3. Now, he's got 18 homers on the year, but only 3 of them now have been against non-fastballs. And, he had a 2-hit game, got on base 3 times after he had 3 doubles in game 1. It was a really good day, at least at the plate, for Jordan Westburg. And yeah, they didn't maybe capitalize a couple times as much as they could have. And they got some bad luck outs, balls in the gap, Kevin Kiermaier making good catches and things like that. But I just thought, even though they scored 4 runs, they continued the good at-bat. They had them Sunday, they had them Monday in game 1, and I think it continued in game 2. And sometimes the results don't help you out as much. They only got the 4 runs, but I liked what I saw again offensively as they, I think, are on the upswing from that team-wide offensive slump. Now, what went wrong in this loss in game 2? Well, that was Cade Povich and the defense behind him. Povich was recalled as the 27th man to start game 2 of the doubleheader on Monday. Remember, you do get a 27th player, an extra player that you can use anytime you have a doubleheader. And 99 times out of 100, it seems at this point, teams will use that on a pitcher, and that is what the Orioles did to go ahead and get Povich up in the big leagues once again to start this game. And it was just not pretty. 4 1/3 innings by Povich. Now 6 runs, only 3 of them were earned, and we'll get to why. 7 hits, 5 walks, 1 strikeout, 94 pitches, 7 hard hit balls. It's not like he was clobbered. And Povich has had some starts like this where he doesn't strike out a lot of guys and walks too many guys, but he's gotten away with some of them earlier in the season in the big leagues because he hasn't allowed a lot of hard contact. Now, 7 hard hit balls in 4 1/3 innings isn't anything insane, but when you start giving up more contact, the walks hurt you more and more. And when you're walking 5 batters and only striking out 1 and the ball is in play, it is not a good recipe to have success at the big league level. And that is what Povich saw on Monday. He had just 6 swings and misses in this game, despite 45 swings, just wasn't really fooling anyone with any of his stuff. The location was not good. He wasn't like terrible in terms of being in and out of the strike zone, but he just couldn't. It felt like he couldn't command any of his pitches. Like he got some big outs with the fastball up in the zone. That's generally where he goes for the big outs. But overall, it was just kind of tough to watch. And that's the thing with Cade Povich. Like the walks have been the issue throughout the minor leagues. The walks have been the issue in the major leagues when he's gotten into trouble, just not being aggressive enough, struggling with his command. And, for Povich, he probably came up earlier this year, earlier than the O's wanted to, because they had the injuries to Means and Bradish and Wells, and they just needed starting pitching reinforcements. And he's here because of the doubleheader. So you have the extra game, you need an extra starter. But between him and between the struggles that Albert Suarez has had lately, it's those are your number 5 and 6 starters right now for the Orioles. And Chase McDermott was fine in his startup, but maybe not ready to fully join the rotation. He's your number 7 guy. Like, you can make a strong argument that the Orioles need another starting pitcher. I think this outing from Povich showed that. He still has a lot of promise. I still like the stuff. There just needs to be a little more command so he can fine-tune those pitches and then he can go out of the strike zone. Like, for example, I thought his changeup was his best pitch on Monday, and yet he only threw it 9 times out of 94 pitches despite facing a good amount of righties, and that's usually a pitch that for a lefty is a weapon against right-handed hitters. Like, maybe when you're really struggling, try to go to that a little bit more. That could have been a possibility. Got a couple of good-looking pitches and outs with that. But he will presumably go back down to AAA, and we'll kind of see from there. I mean, he's going to be good depth, you would think, down the stretch, but you also want a better starter in that rotation, and there's time to do that later today, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But the defense didn't help him out either. I mean, it was 6 runs, but only 3 of them were earned. Gunnar Henderson got the day off, much needed, well, not the day off. He played in game 1, but much needed that he did get one of these 2 games off. So Jordan Westburg got his first start at shortstop because Jorge Mateo, the usual backup shortstop, is still out with that elbow dislocation. And Westburg made a nice play in the 9th inning, but before that, he had 3 plays that were just not good at all. 1, he just misread a hop and allowed an RBI single. 1, he just didn't catch a throw from O'Hearn on a pickoff, turned into an error, and eventually the run scored. And then 1, just a bad throwing error to open up the 5th inning that put Povich in a really bad spot, and what ended up being, or that was the 4th inning, excuse me, but put Povich in a bad spot where he gave up a couple of runs in that inning. Just a couple other iffy plays down the stretch. We know Gunner's been struggling a little bit with the throwing arm. O's infield defense just has not been good lately. Worst thing to have happen when you're playing poorly is bad defense. That's the ugliest thing to watch. We saw that again in game 2. It's not great. Again, you didn't have Gunner out there, so it's not your number 1 defense, but it's just, they got to clean things up a little bit. I mean, O'Hearn booted an easy ball in the 9th inning. It's got to be cleaned up a little bit, and it will be. These are talented players that played good defense most of the year, but it gets a little ugly when you start to kick the ball around. And a shout out to, in the 8-4 loss, it goes to Cole Irvin. He had been, let's put it like it is, he had been real bad lately, whether it was his last few starts before moving to the bullpen. And then honestly, in the bullpen, he had not been good at all. But the Orioles turned it over to him in the 6th They're trailing 6-3. It's just, hey, give us some length, keep us in the game. And he did that. 3 innings of 1-run ball, 4 hits, 5 strikeouts, and no walks for Irvin on 54 pitches, just 4 hard hit balls against him. And this was after Irvin threw 38 pitches in relief on Saturday when he was kind of playing mop-up duty. First time this year pitching on just 1 day of rest. He comes out there and he gave the Orioles 54 strong pitches. I mean, the only run he gave up was a solo home run hit by Vladimir Guerrero Jr. in the 8th. And it was like, well, Vladdy was doing that to everyone in this one. I mean, 4 extra base hits for Vladimir Guerrero Jr., 3 doubles and a home run in game number 2. They certainly could not get him out after he had a 3 for 5 with a homer in game 1. Yeah, that was quite a day for Vladdy, who's just been, I mean, you could argue the best hitter in baseball in the month of July or so. He's been amazing for the Blue Jays. And other than that, Irvin was really, really good. I thought that was like the best cutter he had in a long time. It had good velocity. It had good movement. It had good command. Like I liked the changeup when he threw it. It was good to see. And yeah, if the Orioles do end up adding maybe another reliever and another starter here on deadline day, Irvin's spot could be on the chopping block, even though he's got a couple more years of control and the Orioles need starting pitchers next year with the injuries. And he has been a starter most of his career. With this many struggles and this team trying to win a World Series, he could be on that roster bubble. But if he pitches like this more often when he's in this long relief role, that allows you to keep him on the roster. And I thought he did look really good. And the other thing was they needed him to do it. And it was not just, hey, keep the game close. They needed it because it's a doubleheader. Now, the O's were lucky because Eflin pitched well. They only needed to use Keegan Aiken and Birch Smith out of the bullpen in the game 1 win. But because they used so many relievers over the weekend, and specifically in the win over the Padres on Sunday, the only 2 guys coming into game 2 who hadn't pitched either on Sunday or in game 1 on Monday were Cole Irvin and Craig Kimbrell. And you're not going to throw Craig Kimbrell out there probably in the 6th inning at this point. So they went to Irvin, but you get to the 9th and you just kind of had to use Kimbrell. So even though the Orioles were down 7-4 in the top of the 9th, using Kimbrell there, I'm not sure says a whole lot about like, oh, is he still the closer or not after a couple of tough outings at the end of the week? It was more about, hey, everybody else wasn't rested and Kimbrell was on 2 days rest. So let's just get him out there. And maybe it's a little get right outing in a low leverage spot. Now, he still did give up a run in that spot, but still, it was more about just like he was the only guy available. And if Irvin hadn't, pitched through the 8th, if he had only gotten through the 7th or something like that, it would have been a bad spot for the O's. They would have had to use Cano or Perez or someone like that. And then those guys who pitched Sunday would have had to pitch in a low leverage spot and then wouldn't be available on Tuesday if the Orioles needed them. So just a shout out to Cole Irvin for keeping the O's bullpen in a good spot heading into game 3 of this series here tonight. But before the next game of this series even kicks off, we're going to have the trade deadline, 6 p.m. Eastern time here on Tuesday. The O's reportedly are still looking to add. Who is still out there that the O's could add to this team? I'll tell you that to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. What is Prize Picks? How do you play? Well, all you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and then you watch the winnings roll in. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can go and watch Team USA rack up the gold medals this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup of players across basketball, soccer, tennis, golf, and more, and it takes like 60 seconds. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So the Orioles enter the trade deadline at 63-44, a half game up on the Yankees for first place in the AL East. They've already done some additions, adding Sir Anthony Dominguez and Christian Pache from the Phillies, bolstering the bullpen with Dominguez, adding Zach Eflin from the Rays, a good first start with the O's on Monday. He helps their rotation. But Ken Rosenthal has reported in the last couple of days since the O's made those trades Friday that the Orioles are still looking to add potentially another reliever, another starter, and even a right-handed hitting outfielder as well, as they're looking around at what these other teams have to offer. And it's intriguing. And honestly, I think the O's should add more. I mean, at the very least, they need to add one more arm, whether it's a starter or a reliever, before today's deadline. So I wanted to take a quick look here at who is still available. Now, this is as of just shy of midnight here on Monday night, who is still available. So if you're listening to this and other guys have been traded over the night or Tuesday morning or whenever it is, just know that this is kind of the list as of now of who the O's could go and get that they could be interested in. In terms of that right-handed hitting outfielder, it still could behoove the Orioles to get someone like that. I think the two main options out there, because Tommy Pham was traded on Monday, is Kevin Pillar of the Angels and maybe Mark Canha of the Tigers. If you're looking at starting pitching, the Giants did just trade Jorge Soler in kind of a salary dump. They might be looking to dump Blake Snell's salary. There's been some reporting that the Orioles are interested there. Garrett Crochet and Tarek Skubal are still out there. I do not see them being traded at all. Chris Bassett, maybe, if the Blue Jays decide to sell their non-rentals. He is slated to pitch Tuesday's game against the Orioles. There's Zach Littell of the Rays as well. Jack Flaherty, the Orioles are reportedly open to a reunion with him. The Rangers won on Monday. You got Nathan Eovaldi, maybe Andrew Haney. I don't think the Rangers sell, but maybe if they do, you got the lefty Tyler Anderson of the Angels. Jamison Taillon, there's reported interest from the Orioles there. Righty from the Cubs, who would have 2 more years after this. Cal Quantrill of the Rockies, maybe. That's kind of your list of guys who are still out there. Then with relievers, there's obviously way more of them, but the big ones the Orioles could be going after: Chad Green, who we just saw pitch with the Blue Jays, John Brebbia of the White Sox, Andrew Chafin of the Detroit Tigers. Again, David Robertson, Kirby Yates, maybe if the Rangers sell. Luis Garcia of the Angels, Lucas Erceg, Austin Adam, all those guys with the A's. Most of the Marlins guys are still there. They have traded A.J. Puck to the D-backs. I was kind of in on Puck, but Tanner Scott's still there, and all of those other intriguing Marlins relievers. Kyle Finnegan of the Nationals, Mark Leiter Jr., who I love, from the Cubs, could potentially be dealt. Like, there's a lot of names still out there that the Orioles could go after. Now, my prediction is they will make at least one more trade. I would not guarantee it, but pretty close to guarantee they'll make at least one more move before the deadline again is at 6 p.m. Eastern time. If I had to predict right now, I would say that the Orioles add Tanner Scott. I think there's been enough reporting. I believe there's a report from John Heyman that the Orioles are one of 4 teams aggressively pursuing Tanner Scott. I think it'll be expensive, but I think he helps them as a closer. The strikeout rates are good. The walk rates still scare me, but they've been going down. The stuff is so good that maybe a reunion would help. And then, I don't know, because the best pitchers to target are on the Rangers, and I don't think they're trading them. And the Jack Flaherty thing would be super odd, even though he's a great name that's out there. So my prediction, honestly, is going to be just Tanner Scott. I think the prices get too high elsewhere. The Orioles end the deadline with 2 relievers, Dominguez and Scott, and 1 starter in Eflin, and go from there. I still think they would like to add another starting pitcher, but I just don't know if the prices will be there. But certainly we will keep that monitored here. And then the plan would be, if the O's do make a trade close to the deadline, I'm going to try to go live with an episode on Tuesday afternoon or evening whenever the Orioles do make a trade. The plan is that I'd most likely be at work during the day, so it's tougher to do that. But anything in the evening, anything happens late afternoon, I'm going to try to get you a live episode with a reaction to that deal. And then the Orioles also do have a baseball game to play here on Tuesday night, game 3 of a 4-game set against the Blue Jays. Chris Bassett, if he's not traded, will go for Toronto, 3.78 ERA for the veteran righty. And Corbin Burns takes the ball for the Orioles in a 6:35 start. If the Orioles do make a trade, most likely there'll be a live episode Tuesday evening breaking it down. If they don't make a trade, or even if they do, I'll still be back on Wednesday as well to recap game 3 between the O's and the Blue Jays and talk about any further fallout from the Orioles' moves at the trade deadline as well. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.